Please be advised, if you are traditional, you may not want to hear my story. I'm half Navajo and half Mexican. For over 20 years of my life, I lived on the Navajo Nation reservation in New Mexico. My Native American side of my family always warned us to be careful at night. My grandparents would always tell me stories of these shape-shifting witches who can curse you or kill you. They called them Skinwalkers. They called them this because they would take the skin of dead animals and wear them to change into that animal or something in between an animal and a human, but not in the same way as a werewolf. I never believed in it really. I'm only half Navajo and very light-skinned, so I was never treated the same by most people here. So I drifted away from the culture and thought that it just wasn't for me. It was around summer when this happened. I was in high school at the time, so probably 6 to 8 years ago. I used to hang out with a group of guys who liked to do a lot of delinquent type stuff. You know, smoke cigarettes, stay out at night. A lot of times at night, we would go sneak out to a place we called Paradise. I know it's ironic, the name. It's basically a giant metal pipe that carries irrigation water to all the farms, but it was also a spot for kids to drink or get high in the evenings. The place did have a very scary history of kids and adults who drowned or died during the night, but I always assumed those were just urban legends. Us boys would test each other to cross the pipe. Sort of an initiation, see how far you could get. We usually could go all the way across. Now keep in mind that pipe goes well over 3 stories high. It's also very wide. I'd say as wide as an average car. We would walk this thing for kicks in large groups. So one night, me and a small group of friends were driving around bored at 2 a.m., wanting to spook each other. So I said, let's go to Paradise and walk the pipe. Most of the friends I was hanging out with had never done it like I had. They agreed to it, all pumped up on energy drinks, and we drove. It was pretty quiet. The sky was dark and the night was cold. The boys with me were named Michael, Corey, Tommy, and Theral. Now, Theral was the driver because he had the car and his family was pretty well off, and he never had to worry much about cash. When we got to the place, he said he didn't want to go. He said his parents were traditional and he just wanted to chill in the car. Basically, he just wanted to text some girl, I'm sure, without us bugging him. I told him it's fine and to keep the car locked and running in case we seen something scary. And me and the other boys went on without him. As we got onto the pipe, a few of the guys were scared and had me take the lead. We'd crawled, I'd say, 1/4 of the way on the pipe, talking and laughing. I noticed a faint, white or light gray bat bigger than my head flying around us. It dived for us a few times and we dodged it, but then Tommy slipped and almost fell off of the pipe. I reached out, grabbing his right arm. Michael had grabbed my shirt collar, and Corey had grabbed him. All together we got back on the pipe, shaken that we had almost lost Tommy to the darkness below. The bat was gone now. We were all freaking out, but the guys wanted to continue. We laughed it off, as guys usually do. We passed the halfway point on the pipe with no problems. But as we got a little farther, Michael saw something. At the end of the pipe, there's a hill. Behind that hill, it's pretty brightly lit because of a church somewhere off in the distance. Anyways, on that hill, we see a black figure with pointy ears. The silhouette of a dog. Now, Michael was a tough guy. He yelled at the thing, saying, "I'm not scared of you, you skinwalker," and tossed a few rocks he had in his pocket. One of the rocks hit the pipe while the others fell into the brush below. Then, that shadowy silhouette dog stood up on two legs just like a person. We all freaked out. Our jaws dropped. Then Corey said, "Look, there's another one to the left." And Tommy said there was another on the right. 3 silhouettes of pointy dog-eared people on the hill. I told them all to back up so we can get back to the car. These things to the right and the left of the hill started to move down towards us. Now, we were trying to get back, but we're still 3/4 of the way across this pipe, and under us is complete darkness. It was quiet for a few minutes. Then we heard a girl crying. It sounded like she was hurt and scared, maybe even in pain. We were overcome with a strange feeling of wanting to help. Michael wanted to go back towards the end and crawl down and help this girl. I almost followed as well, but something inside me was like, no, this is wrong, something isn't right. So I yelled at him and everyone, telling them they're stupid, telling them to look back at the things on the hill. It's definitely a trap. Forget about that fake crying. If there's a girl hurt down there, we'll come back when the sun comes up in 2 hours and check. The moment I said this, the crying stopped. All the guys started freaking out more, saying they can't believe what had come over them. They said they'd almost forgot what we saw before. Halfway on the pipe now, we hear a native drum being played like a powwow. We started running on this pipe. A third of the way back, almost to the car, Corey stops us. We can all hear it under our feet. It sounds like a pack of snarling, growling, and yelping coyotes. It's pitch dark below, but we know they're under us. So we run, full speed, not looking back once until we get to the car, hop in and yell drive, and haul ass on that dirt road to get back to a well-lit gas station. We explained what happened to Theral. We couldn't get the girls crying out of our head, and we went back in daylight just to make sure. We didn't find a girl. Instead, in that area we heard the crying, we saw a coyote watching us a close distance away. And it was not shy and just looked at us for about 4 seconds and walked off into the brush. I never went back there after that. This happened after midnight, closer to 2 a.m., and I was in my car patrolling. I parked under a tree, and I guess I semi-drifted off. Suddenly, something struck the bottom of my car with enough force to make it sway. Now, this patrol car was rather heavy, 1978 Thunderbird. I started the car and pulled forward, turning around in the hotel lot. Sitting where I had been parked was a dog-like thing with a very odd face, staring me down. I felt a dark energy about it, like it was invading my soul. It had human features, especially the eyes. They had that spark of humanity, but I could tell they were completely evil. The creature's face didn't have a long snout. It looked like a human nose. A bit extended, but not black-tipped like a dog. As for size and body, it was a bit bigger than a German Shepherd. Its fur was rather mangy and dirty-looking, black and tan, and it was very thickly muscled. Looking at this thing gave me that feeling of fear instinctively, when you know you're in big danger. Anyways, I hit the gas and tried to hit it with my car. The creature ran off the property onto the native land across the road. It then ran back across onto the hotel property. I made chase and it ran into a third parking lot. I followed it into an area called the Ponds, where the weeds grow about 8 to 9 feet tall. There were 2 large cesspools there, and the area was very weed-filled. I parked and grabbed my pistol and ran on foot after it. I could hear it moving through the weeds. It was circling, trying to come up behind me. Then it rushed me. It threw me aside like I was built out of matchsticks. I felt around for a moment and found my pistol and made chase. What had ran in on 4 legs ran back out on 2. It looked now like a shambling, nude man, but not quite right. It was screaming an inhuman scream as it fled. A scream both human and animal. It was horrifying. That thing ran across an area that had sagebrush and cactus in the direction of some houses, so I couldn't risk taking a shot at it. I've never seen anything like it since. I've been wanting to share an experience I had, an encounter with something I believe to be a Skinwalker. About a year and a half ago, I had some friends come over. We had been playing Magic the Gathering for a while and had gotten bored, so I figured I'd show them this abandoned house about a mile away. Me and some other friends have dubbed this the Spook House. It wasn't really that bad of a house, but this was around 1 a.m., making it all the more fun. I had planned to act like a tour guide for them, maybe even try to scare them a little, even though the only scary thing I could actually imagine was running into a methed up homeless person. We eventually get to the house, and after about 10 to 15 minutes, I begin my tour guide routine. It's important to note you can only get through the back since the front's boarded up and I don't like to vandalize things. We're walking up the driveway to the back, and I'm looking at them and talking about the house with my back turned to the back door when my friend gets this horrified look on his face, and in a mix between yelling and whispering, tells us to look. So I look behind me and see what looks like a person crawling out of the house on their hands and knees. I could only see the front half of it, but this person looks at us, has huge wide eyes that pretty much match its skin. It was very pale, extremely skinny. Think of those pictures of Holocaust survivors just getting freed. It had no hair anywhere that I could tell. It stopped looking at us after a second and bolted into the woods behind the house at a very fast speed. Needless to say, we were all pretty terrified of what it could be. We booked it back to my house and stayed up all night. As we were talking, a giant tree branch fell in my backyard. I'm not saying it was related, it was just a very strange coincidence that gave us yet another scare. I had no real idea what skinwalkers were back then, but I did know about the rake stories. I've honestly never been that terrified in my life. We were probably only 15 or 20 feet from it. Whenever I was scared as a child, my dad had always told me that in life, you should not be scared of ghosts. He said, fear the living because they can actually hurt you. In my late teenage years, I came into some money after my father committed suicide and I received an inheritance from him. At the time of my dad's passing, he and my mom owned a cabin. The cabin had been put up for sale since my mom could no longer afford the payments, and renting it out was not covering that either. The cabin was set to go on the market for sale in less than a month, and we were in the process of finalizing the paperwork with the realtor and lawyer. So for that month time, the cabin was not going to be rented out any longer and was going to be vacant. I saw this as a chance to get away for a while and clear my head in light of all the things going on. I quit my job, packed up all of my gear, grabbed my dog, and headed up in my dad's car, the one he had willed to me. Now, this was our family cabin that my parents rented out throughout the year whenever we were not using it, so I had keys to the cabin and also had the code for the alarms. My first 2 days in the cabin were normal and nothing out of the unusual happened. I spent my days playing with my dog in the snow, and the evenings playing PlayStation or listening to music, drinking and smoking out on the balcony. I had already stocked up on food, cigarettes, liquor. I was pretty much a shut-in aside from the occasional hike with my dog as company. I was quite content and started to feel relaxed after all the drama that had preceded my outing. The cabin itself was 2 stories. The bottom story had the living room and a side guest bedroom along with a small kitchen. Upstairs had another 2 rooms, along with a walkout balcony attached to the master bedroom. Most of my time there was either spent in the living room, kitchen, or master bedroom. I never really went into the other rooms and kept the doors leading into them shut. Open doors to dark rooms have always actually kind of creeped me out. But anyways, the 3rd day came around and I was going through my usual routine of playing with my dog. His name was Midnight, by the way. He's also since passed on. That day it was pretty heavy snowfall, so I did not feel like trekking down the hill to the main road in my car and decided to stay in. That's when things started getting a bit weird. In our area, there were only 2 other cabins adjacent to ours, maybe a block away from each other. All the other cabins, aside from those 2, were around a mile away from ours. Surrounding us was mostly forest and very tall pine trees. Both cabins were empty, and from the past couple of days I knew that no one was currently staying there. Around midday, while outside with my dog, I noticed what looked like footprints in the snow around the area surrounding our cabin. It was still snowing at the time, so the footprints looked fairly fresh. Like someone had been there in the past 20-30 minutes before me. I thought for a second that maybe someone was staying in the cabin near me and I may not have noticed. Maybe they were shut-ins like me. The prints led away from my cabin and they disappeared into the snow towards the denser part of the trees, so I disregarded them and went back inside. Nighttime came around and I decided to head to bed. My dog Midnight was laying on the bed with me, and I noticed his ears perk up to a standstill listening position. This was followed by him quickly jumping off the bed and running downstairs to the living room. I lay in bed and stayed silent as I was kind of freaked out. I could hear him moving around down the stairs back and forth. After about 5 minutes, he ran back upstairs to me and started to do his dog dance for the sign that he had to pee or wanted to go outside for some reason. I couldn't say no to him, so we both went downstairs to the outside driveway and wait for him to do his thing. Only, he didn't want to use the bathroom. As soon as we were outside, he started to pull on his leash, trying to drag me to where he wanted to go. He kept looking into the dense part of the trees where the prints had been earlier. But he also kept sniffing on the side of the house and looking up towards the roof. After he figured out that I was not going to go where he wanted, he sat himself down and just stared into the darkness. This was a bit unusual for him, but okay, maybe there are forest animals out there he wants to chase down. But I didn't want to chance anything, so I pulled him back inside and we both headed back upstairs. Around half an hour later, I was lying in bed when I heard what sounded like hooves walking on my roof. It was only a series of around 6 steps, and I tried to rationalize that it could be a pine cone falling from a tree onto the roof, or maybe some kind-hearted small forest animal running around. But the thing was, the steps seemed to be spaced apart, like a man's stride, so it was really freaking me out. Midnight also heard the noise and was quick to run to the balcony screen door, expecting me to let him outside. You know what? I'm a tough guy, and at the time considered myself to be fairly well built and strong enough to handle myself. So I grabbed my coat and shoes along with my cigarettes and flashlight and went out onto the balcony. As soon as I was outside, I lit up my cigarette and started canvassing the roof with my light. Nothing there, and the snow on top was undisturbed. That was weird. Could it have all just been in my head? But what about Midnight hearing the noise? Maybe he was just feeding off of my fear and paranoia. I started to calm down and relax again. I was shaking. My eyes started to adjust to the darkness. I kept smoking and just staring at the stars and trees next to our cabin. That's when I saw it. In a tree that was a little taller than our cabin and about 20 feet from the balcony, I saw what looked like a man crouched in a squatting position in between 2 branches. It was squatted on one branch and its arms were extended above its head, holding on to the branch above it. What the hell is that? I wasn't sure if I was really seeing this thing, and I just stood up staring and sat there motionless. I noticed Midnight stand up and start pacing behind me and lightly barking at the same time. This thing still did not move. I put my cigarette out and was debating on shining the light in the thing's direction, but something in my head kept screaming not to. I walked back inside and pulled Midnight in with me. Once inside, I locked the door and shined the light in this thing's direction, but there was nothing there now. I shut the curtains to the screen door and retreated back to bed. But later on in the night, I heard light tappings at the screen door, like someone was tapping on the glass with their finger. It was very consistent and did not stop for nearly an hour. Midnight seemed to stare at the door the whole time, but he wouldn't go anywhere near it anymore. The weirdest part was that I had a feeling like someone was inviting me to open the door. But at the same time, I kept hearing my dad's voice in my head telling me to stay in bed and just not do it. I listened to my dad's voice and stayed where I was. I passed out eventually and woke up in the morning and everything was normal. The rest of the week I spent there was non-eventful and nothing else out of the ordinary happened. I was going for a walk. It was late and I had nothing else to do. I was about a mile away from my house, walking on a path in a field far from the main road. It was about 2 a.m., but that wasn't a problem. My parents always trusted that I would return home. Anyways, I was walking past a tree line when I started to hear static, like an old radio. At least that's the only thing I could compare it to. I was rather frightened by this, but I decided to keep walking. Then I heard in a child's voice, "Help." I stopped short. I looked at the tree line frozen, debating what to do. I then stuck one foot out to where the voice came from. Again, I heard the voice repeating what it had just said. This time, I felt a bit uneasy. The voice sounded so similar to the first time it had called out, as if someone was just repeating a recording. Also, it had a bit of that static sound to it. I can't explain it very well, but I called out hello. There was no answer. My voice was shaky from fear because I didn't know what to think of the voice. Then it spoke again, this time in my voice, repeating hello. It sounded just like me, but with that same static. It said it again, the same exact tone from the first time, and I backed up a bit, terrified of what I had just heard. I turned and started walking away in a fast pace when I heard a branch snap, and I stopped and looked back and saw a deer. It was just staring at me from the tree line. I was confused and thought, was it the deer to myself, and then threw away this idea because of how stupid it sounded even in my head. I ignored the deer and started walking again. I walked for not even a minute when I heard something behind me. I quickly turned to see the same deer standing on the path. Now that it was out in the open, and what moonlight there was shone onto the deer, I could see it much more clearly now. It did have a deer head, but the body looked like a human, slumped over on all fours. The ribs were slightly showing. It took me a second to realize just how big this thing was. If it were a person, they would have to be huge. I stood there frozen for what seemed like a minute. Then this thing started to stand up. When it was fully standing, it had to be over 7 foot tall. It stood perfect, like a human would. I tried to think of the situation logically. My assumption was that this was a tall person trying to scare people. But the head was too real, so I dismissed this quickly. After a bit of staring at this creature, I finally decided to step back. As I did, the creature took a step forward, not making a sound. I stood frozen again, scared to make a noise. Then this thing said hello again in my voice, the same exact way it had the previous times. I was more confused than scared at this point. Rather than thinking to run or escape or anything, I was just thinking to myself, how could this thing speak? I asked it, "What are you?" It was silent for a bit, and then the thing spoke in my voice again, with the same static sound accompanying it, repeating what I had just said, still staring at me. I was just frozen, staring at the thing while it did the same thing to me. I wanted to run or something, but my body just wouldn't allow me to. So I stayed in that same position for what seemed like hours. Then finally, for no reason, it walked away back into the tree line. This was a little terrifying to witness. It walked on 2 feet like any normal person would until it was out of sight. As soon as it got silent, I sped quickly down the path, back towards my house. I was sure I would get home, no problems. But I was wrong. I heard another branch break, and I started sprinting, not knowing what was going to happen. I started to see the main road and my house in sight, but still a distance away. Then I heard this thing scream. It sounded like a child screaming at the top of their lungs, and it was still breaking branches. I'm sure it was running above the trees. When I got onto the road and a few hundred feet away from my house, all the noises had stopped. I looked back over my shoulder and saw it standing there in the middle of the road, just staring at me. Right before I turned to continue running, I heard it loudly say hello. It never followed me after that, and that was the only time I ever encountered it or even heard it.